from three great servants of God, Abraham, Moses, and Daniel. Certain features are emerging from our examples which characterize men and women who've mastered this art of intercession. For example, let me list some. First, intimacy with God. Second, boldness in approaching God. Third, conviction of God's absolute justice, both positive and negative, that God will spare the righteous but judge the wicked. Fourth, a concern for God's glory, and conversely, a disregard of personal interests and ambitions. Fifth, a dedication to the task, even at the cost of life itself, even if it means the lion's den. And sixth, willingness to identify with those for whom we intercede. This kind of praying is not like that of the Pharisee, who said, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are. This kind of praying identifies itself with those for whom we pray. We say we have sinned, not they have sinned. Now, for our fourth example of the ministry of intercession, we will look today at the story of Queen Esther. The incident we're going to look at is taken from the 4th chapter of the book of Esther. But first we need to fill in briefly the historical background. Esther was a beautiful Jewish maiden in the Persian Empire in the time of the exile of the Jewish people from their land and from the city of Jerusalem. She was an orphan who had been brought up by her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai was an important official in the court of the Persian emperor. At a certain point, Esther had been chosen to become the new queen of the Persian Empire and had been raised up to a position of tremendous influence and importance in the emperor's palace, in the king's palace. However, Esther had never publicly revealed the fact that she was Jewish. After she'd been raised up as queen, a certain anti-Semite, an official in the court of the Persian emperor named Haman, had hatched a plot and obtained the endorsement of the emperor that on a certain day, some way ahead, there would be a pogrom against all the Jewish people in the entire Persian Empire, and they would all be destroyed. His plan was nothing less than that of total genocide, the destruction of the entire Jewish nation. And probably all the Jews in the world were living at that time within the borders of the Persian Empire. So it was a desperate situation. When this decree went forth, Mordecai sent a message to Esther in the queen's palace that it was her responsibility to get to the king and persuade him to change his mind about the decree. Esther sent back word that she had had no access to the king for quite a while. Then the message came back again from Mordecai to Esther, and that she was to go in on behalf of her people. She sent back again this word, and we're going to read now from Esther chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, that's the capital city, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Well, there's a picture again of an intercessor. Note the commitment. If I perish, I perish. Whether I live or die, that's not the most important question. The most important question is that I do what I can on behalf of my people. Note what Mordecai said. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? This applies to us as Christians. We're a kingdom of priests. We've come to royal position. We cannot turn away from our responsibilities and be indifferent any more than Esther could. We must be willing to identify ourselves with the rest of God's people. We cannot hide away in some palace and say, well, this crisis doesn't concern me. We've got to be like Daniel, like Esther, willing to lay down our life, to risk all, to stand by the people of God, to identify ourselves with God's purposes, to take up the prayer burden. And then notice that Esther, just like Daniel, knew that there are times when praying alone is not enough. She said, not only must we pray, but all of us will have to fast 3 days and 3 nights. And after we've prayed and fasted, then I'll go in to the king and see what comes. Now we'll read how Esther went in to the king. Reading on in the 5th chapter of the book of Esther. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace. I like that phrase, the inner court. Intercession always means coming into the inner court, into the immediate presence of the Lord. So she stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and held out to her